Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are right now on the globe. Welcome to this discussion, an extremely interesting and timely discussion, and I will explain why later on. So, a bit of a background. The European Commission decided to have a third-party assessment of this 10-year adventure of Greece, macroscopically, and in order to find out what went wrong, what went right, and what is the outcome of this 10-year adventure. This survey has been assigned to two very prominent international organizations, CEPS and the BRM. So we will hear from the protagonists, the stars of this critical 10 years. We will hear from them, we will hear the comments, and of course we will hear them talking about that. We have them all connected right now. Firstly, let me introduce our host, because everything you see today takes place thanks to the Economic Chamber of Greece, which fulfills the role that's supposed to play, the advisor of the Greek government. President Konstantinos Kollias is right here with us. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Let's have the panel. Okay, we have Mr. Yannis Sounaras, Governor of the Bank of Greece. We have the Minister of Finance, Mr. Christos Staikouras, the former Minister of Finance, Mr. Euclid Tsakalotos, and the former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of the Hellenic Republic, the four, let's say, protagonists of this very important adventure. Mr. Kollias, you have the floor. Firstly, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with us online, given the circumstances, given the current situation we all experience. Thank you for being part of the second digital forum organized by the Chamber. It's a great honor for our organization to host such an event, both because of the pedigree of our panelists and the authors of these surveys, and of course all our speakers have played a very important role in the course of these these 10 years for the Greek economy. So this survey, carried out on behalf of the European Commission, is presented following an initiative by the Chamber, and it proves the following: A, that there is an increasing prominence of establishment organization that plays a very important role in these circumstances. And of course, I would like to thank both these two organizations, CEPS and IMS, for accepting our invitation and for the exquisite collaboration we have had. Second, it proves that the Economic Chamber of Greece successfully plays the role of being a consultant, advisor to the government of Greece, of Hellenic Republic, and by means of this role, we play a very important role in decision-making process and providing with feedback on critical issues of the Greek economy. So, in this context, this is what we've done during the bailout agreements, the memoranda as we call them. Responsibly, we approached and we considered all policies and measures implemented in a scientific way with no populistic background or driving forces. And I'd like to highlight that this discussion is not taking place in order to celebrate or to criminalize the policies implemented during those 10 years, but to analyze specific financial data. The Economic Chamber of Greece, since the beginning, stressed the following. A, the main fault, the main mistake of the adjustment programs have been that they emphasized a lot on increasing taxes and decreasing expenditure, and not increasing investments, both public and private ones, because especially in the case of the private investments, very few things happened in order to facilitate them. B, in the context of these programs of financial adjustment, we should have seized the opportunity in order to establish a very simple, flexible tax system that would allow potential investors to plan in the long run, in the medium and long run, without having to suffer abrupt changes and surprises. Third, we were not as quick, as immediate as we should be when about the NPLs, so that both households would avail themselves of certain arrangements in times of great financial distress, and for enterprises and firms being able to find some space to breathe. and of course, as a result of that, having a better P&L and more budget to use. These financial adjustment programs, despite the distortions, the fixations, the mistakes by the IMF and other stakeholders, if these adjustment programs came hand in hand with the financial aid by the European Union, showing that Greece, it was very important for Greece to stay within the European Union at a time when some very specific people were very quick to encourage or to support our exit from the European Union. So, without further ado, we have the authors of these surveys to explain more about their outcome, and of course we have our great panelists. And of course we'd like to thank you, Mr. Tsimas, for moderating this event. It's my honor, actually, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here and not just being an attendant online. Thank you very much, dear President, and allow me to say the following. I've said that in the past, that when in 2010 we felt as if the sky was coming down, there were three questions that arose. A, why did this happen? How did this happen? And what should we do? These last two questions, apparently, were very difficult to be replied following a common consensus, because there were some financial, political, and ideological differences in between. The difficulty, it was surprising that we had a huge difficulty even to agree on the first question. It was very rare having a country being unable to understand how did this happen and find a common solution to the problem. So let's hope that this discussion will allow us to come up with a common narrative about these three financial adjustment programs. My apologies for this intervention and for this comment of mine. I'd like to give the floor now to the authors. Let me start with the Director of Research of the Center for European Policy Studies, Mrs. Cinzia Altidi. She's the Director of Research of the CEPS. He speaks in Italian. Dice che il nome si pronuncia come Cynthia. Okay. Sorry, but I have to switch back to English now. So you have the floor, Mrs. Altidi.
Many thanks for inviting me here today. Many thanks to the Economic Chamber of Greece. It's a great honor and pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel and to have the opportunity to share the findings of the study that we did. Can we show the first slide, please? So what I'm going to present, as it was said earlier, is mostly driven by the research for a study which was prepared in response to a request for services from the European Commission. But I have to say this is an independent study. CEPS is an independent think tank, so what I'm presenting is not reflecting the view of the European Commission. I mean, in order to complement what was said earlier, these are background studies. A full ex-post assessment of the Greek adjustment programs will actually be launched by the European Commission next year. So these are only very specific studies focusing on specific aspects. In particular, what I'm going to present on debt, sovereign debt, which of course was one of the main issues at stake in the programs. Next slide, please. I would like to focus on 3 points. First, I would like to recall some of the events and the context in which the programs were prepared and implemented. Second point is really on that sustainability, and in particular, which critically affected debt and its sustainability, namely private sector involvement and official sector involvement. And then at the end, I will try to draw some lessons. I think what we are discussing today is, of course, of crucial importance for Greece, but it is also of great importance also in a forward-looking way for Greece and potentially for all the countries, given the post-COVID world and economy, which we will be facing soon. Next slide, please. This timeline of events is, I guess, very familiar with many of you, certainly the people in the panel who probably knows many more details than I do about what happened. The purpose of it is just to recall that, in fact, that the three programs which follow one after the other basically were accompanying financial assistance, which in total was very large, almost 290 billion overall, and which was provided by different actors. The first program, the main providers of financial assistance was both the European Union countries, the Greek loan facility and the IMF, and the second one, the IMF and the European Financial Stability, and then the ESM. So this succession and the involvement of different actors, first of all, is witnessing the fact that when the Greek crisis erupted, the European Union and the Monetary Union were not endowed with the mechanisms, nor with the resources in order to be able to support Greece. So in this sense, I think Greece had a first mover disadvantage. It was really the very first crisis, sovereign debt crisis, to which the Monetary Union was facing, and basically the experience of Greece served to build mechanisms and the governance structure that then actually was used in several other cases and for several other member states. Next slide, please. With this background in mind, I want to focus on debt sustainability. And here what I want to highlight is that even if it may be simplistic, but the approach to debt evolved in a quite dramatic way over the three adjustment programs. And in the first program, which was prepared in a quite hastily fashion, basically didn't really focus so much on that sustainability. Of course, there was awareness that Greek debt was high and Greece was facing difficulties in accessing markets. But the priority was very much on a front-loaded adjustment and the short repayment period, financial assistance, in order to convince market that the crisis was just temporary. As the need for a second program emerged more or less 1 year after the first one, it became quite clear that this approach didn't work. And in the second program, the debt became, and its sustainability became a centerpiece. And the approach changed, and the two main measures were based as crucial. The first one was a PSI, so a default on holdings of the private sector, and the second one, an ambitious privatization plan. After the first difficulties, the second program also derailed for a lot of different circumstances and political context, especially in Greece, but also at the European level, which in the end resulted in the need for another program, the third program, which started in 2015, and which basically took a completely different approach, both from the first one, from the first and the second program. And here the approach was really to design a financial assistance which was aiming at ensuring that sustainability, basically by extending the repayment period through reprofiling of debt, and basically with much smaller fiscal adjustment. And next slide. As I anticipated that when assessing the debt, both the PSI and the OSI played a crucial role, but their assessment still today remains not clear-cut, and I will explain in a moment why. So private sector involvement in Greece was one of the largest which ever happened, also in an historical perspective, in peacetime. The face value cut was more than 50%. And in fact, this resulted in reduction of nominal debt of about 100 billion. The fact that this was much smaller than 50% of the total debt, because basically the ECATs could not be applied on or the entire amount of debt, so eligible debt was smaller. So in the end, what the chart on the right-hand side shows is that while 2012 there was a cut in the nominal value of debt because of the persisting deficits, but also because of the very large fall in GDP, the fall in the debt to GDP ratio the year of the PSI was only 12.5%. This was rather small, and what is even more striking is that on the year after, actually that. So if we want to make an assessment of the impact of PSI on debt to GDP, considering that this is a key indicator of sustainability, the result is actually that the overall debt to GDP ratio did not decline, certainly not sufficiently to ensure stability or sustainability of the debt patterns. Next slide, please. I mean, one crucial question is whether, in fact, the impact of the PSI on GDP, so on the denominator of this ratio, actually was so negative that it took down the entire sustainability pattern. And in the study, we tried to measure what was the impact of PSI on the economy through different methodologies. I'm not going into the details. This is quite a difficult exercise. In practice, in 2012, many different events are going on at the same time, and strong linkages, especially between the financial sector, the banking sector, and the real economy are undergoing. But basically, all the results point to the fact that the fall in absence of PSI, so this would point to essentially on a negative impact of certainly on growth on PSI. Here, what I would like to stress is that when doing the study, we also conducted a number of people, of stakeholders who actually, at the time of the PSI, were involved. And on PSI, the judgment is really not clear-cut. So the real of what happened is quite different. What I can say for sure, also based on looking at the experience of all the countries which have experienced default, is that in case of default, GDP tends to fall very sharply, and negotiations for restructuring of debt generally take a lot of time. And it's for these reasons that basically such event cannot underestimate the impact on GDP. Next slide. The other event which I want to highlight is the official sector involvement. I mean, for ERCAT, application of ERCAT on official holdings was never an option. However, after the PSI, it was agreed in two moments, actually in 2012 and then in 2017 on a much larger scale, to have a reprofiling of the debt in the sense of interest rate applied on the loans and extension of the maturity. The two charts on the right illustrate the magnitude of such changes. And the impact of this reprofiling of debt has been crucial, basically, in contributing to support Greece to access again financial markets. Now, ex post, one may be really tempted to say we have the OSI much earlier. This would have avoided a lot of problems and probably negative impact on the economy. This may be the case, but I think it's important to consider two aspects. The first one is, of course, that the OSI was politically agreed only after PSI happened. That was a clear condition which was attached. The second point, it's much more general, and it concerns the macro conditions. We need to remember that between 2010 and 2017, global interest rates fell dramatically, and basically at the time that the reprofiling of the debt was agreed, especially in 2017, risk-free interest rates have turned negative. So basically, the economic conditions, financial conditions for lenders were making concessions easier to be agreed. Next slide, please. The last point I want to make about the economy is really about GDP. I mean, debt is not only about debt that needs to be repaid, and for this GDP is crucial. And I think what happened in the demand and the supply is very important to understand why it took 3 programs in such a long time to Greece. And I think there was a combination and reinforcing of 2 negative mechanisms. The first one is on the demand side. I think at the beginning, it was really misunderstood how much the impact of the fall in demand, in domestic demand, could have on the real economy. It was not well understood that, in fact, Greece is quite a closed economy, which depends very much on domestic demand, and that policies which were focusing too much on increasing competitiveness were deemed not to deliver simply because of the degree of openness. The second point, it really relates on the supply side, which of course is crucially important as the demand side, and on the fact that the structural reforms were a key pillar of all the programs. And systematically, in all the programs and the review of the programs, delays and limited implementation of major reforms comes systematically. One of the main problems in this, of course, and this limited ability of reforms to actually deliver a boost to the economy was largely affected by the lack or the limited political and popular support of reforms, and probably the lack of full knowledge that, in fact, reforms tend to deliver, and in the short term can even have a negative impact. Next slide, and here is I would just to conclude. I think that there are a number of lessons which really should be recalled, as I said, also in a future perspective. And the first one is that it is a crucial importance to recognize, since already at the very beginning, what is the real state of the economy, what are the main features of the economy, in an adjustment program which is appropriate. The second point I want to highlight is that policy measures can have unintended consequences, and this needs to be taken into account. This may include the adjustment cost and the social impact of certain measures. And last but not least, when a country needs to undergo deep transformation and deep change, it is crucial that the country has the ownership of the change, that the people feel part of this change. I think this is a big lesson for the all international lenders, that basically structural transformations which are imposed externally and do not have internal support cannot deliver. Now, on the other side, it is clear that certain countries, economies need change to face the reality and to keep up with a changing world, and this need to be accompanied. So in the case of crisis, of very difficult situation like the ones of adjustment program, I think really need to move towards a sort of cooperative game and not the one where the two parts are opposed. I will stop it here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Algidi. Thank you for your work, and thank you for this.
So the second institution is the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Mr. Cyril Leonel is with us. He's a senior economist of the institution. And Mr. Corrado Macchiarelli, he's a principal economist of the institute. And I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Leonel first.
You have to present the conclusion of your investigation, of your research. Please.
Hello, thank thank you very much for inviting us to this very interesting event. Thank you to the Economic Chamber of Greece. So if you could put on the first slide, so this is work done with myself, Cyril Lenoël, my colleague Corrado Macchiarelli, and Gary Young from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. On the next slide, please. So the main finding, let me start with the main finding. So the Greek adjustment program constituted one of the largest economic challenges since the creation of the euro area, spanning over nearly 10 years and accumulated financing of 290 billion euros. So while fiscal targets were largely achieved, this came at an unnecessarily high cost. And so looking at the fiscal reforms and the macroeconomic path, our first finding is that public investment was used to a greater extent than planned to reduce the deficit. And we find that a better outcome could have been achieved by focusing more on public consumption. The second finding is that one of the key factors that led to the unexpectedly long and sharp recession and explosive debt path was the loss of confidence by market, households, and businesses. And a stronger commitment by the European and Greek authorities to implement the adjustment programs in full would have made the adjustment less costly by reducing the risk premium. And the third finding on the fiscal reforms is that we do not find any compelling evidence that a longer adjustment path would have improved the trade-off between GDP growth and fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation occurred largely at a regular pace between 2010 and 2016, and the scale of the adjustment required was such that the consolidation had to start at a good pace from day one. And turning to labor and market reforms, our analysis shows that the labor market reforms were successful in reducing wage rigidities, in particular starting from 2012. And in light of labor market adjustment, margins rose and export did not expand as was hoped. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, I'm going to show you first some figures on the macroeconomic path. Then I will turn to our counterfactual analysis, and then I will give the floor to my colleague Corrado to talk about the empirical analysis and draw some conclusions. Next slide, please. Looking at the macroeconomic trajectory, so an aggressive fiscal consolidation was achieved, and you can see it on the chart on the left-hand side, where you see so the gray bars are the counterfactual of no adjustment plan. The black line is the adjustment in terms of budget balance to GDP according to the first adjustment program. And the red one is what was actually achieved. So a big adjustment was achieved until 2014, but the chart on the right-hand side shows you that it came at the same time when GDP was falling much more than planned. And so probably not enough consideration was given to the fiscal objectives within the broader macroeconomic objectives. So turning to the next slide. The fiscal targets. So the adjustment program was initially heavily geared towards spending cuts rather than tax increases. But as economic activity and particularly GDP declined much more than expected, the effort turned into collecting the same amount of revenues despite a fall in GDP. and therefore it means that as a share of GDP, revenues increase much more than the corresponding decrease in expenditure. So turning to next slide, please. So now we will sort of show you the result of 3 counterfactuals that we did, looking at how this adjustment could have been made less costly, and how like an alternative path would have looked like. So first, public investment was reduced from around 14 billion in 2009 to 5 billion in 2011, and stayed at a much lower level until the end of the third adjustment program. In particular, infrastructure spending on railways declined by 71% between the 2000 to 2008 period and 2009 and 2015 period. Between 2010 and 2017, public investment co-financed by the EU accounted for as much as 8/10 of total public investment. So that means that the reduction in public investment means that some of the EU funding projects were not implemented because of a lack of funding on the Greek side. And there was no compensating effect as private investment also declined sharply. And in particular, in Greece, public investment accounts for nearly 1/3 of overall investment, compared to an average of 1/8 in the OECD. And so our sort of stakeholder survey has noticed that government found it easier to cut investment than to cut wages and pensions. So if you, on the next slide, please, I will show you a counterfactual where we keep the level of public investment as sort of a pre-2010 level, and we compensate by lower public investment in order to keep a neutral effect on the deficit. And so we use a sort of National Institute global econometric model to do the simulation. And so what we find is that the multiplier effect on GDP is generally higher for investment than consumption shocks. And therefore, the chart here shows you that such a counterfactual would have led to GDP being around 1% higher, and debt to GDP being around 1 percentage point lower over 10 years. So this is significant, but it only explains a small part of the costly adjustment. On the next slide, I will show you what matters even more in the case of the Greek adjustment program, which is the fact that businesses, households, and markets quickly lost confidence in spite of the adjustment programs. So on the left-hand side, you can see the 10-year government bond yield compared to other program countries. And as you know, it reached some punitive rates of around 35% in 2012. And a similar picture on the right-hand side on the European Commission confidence survey shows that it took until 2019 for consumer and business confidence in industry and services to go back to sort of a positive or neutral level. And so government bond risk premium show a lack of trust by financial market over that period, and the risk premium could not increase without a return to confidence. So on the next slide, I show you the simulation we did, which was that what would happen if Greece had managed to keep the 10-year yield a bit lower to the level of Portugal, which had the second highest level. And to do that, we lower the risk premium. And what this would do is that it would have decreased the user cost of capital and moderated the dramatic fall in investment that occurred in Greece. And what we find on the chart on the right-hand side is that GDP would have been around 7% higher, and debt to GDP lower by up to 23 percentage points. So the restoration of confidence could have come from more decisive and coordinated actions by the main stakeholder in the adjustment program, both at the national and international level. And so this loss of confidence explains a large part of the unexpected cost of the adjustment. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you a third counterfactual we did looking at the length of the adjustment program. So many stakeholders have argued that the adjustment program in Greece was too severe, constrained by the IMF 3-year framework. So while this is true, I show you on the chart on the left-hand side the fiscal effort expressed as a budget balance improvement compared to the fourth quarter of 2009. And what you can see is that even though there's been like 3 waves corresponding to the 3 adjustment programs, from 2010 to 2016, the fiscal consolidation was actually quite regular. And after 2016, the consolidation was quite minimal. On the in the table on the right-hand side, I'm showing you that it's mainly indirect tax, so VAT, that explains a large part of the consolidation, nearly half of the consolidation as a ratio of GDP. And so in the next slide, we do sort of a counterfactual of extending by 3 more years the adjustment program without making any change to the mix of tax increases and spending cuts. And what we find is that spreading the consolidation over a longer period would probably not have improved the trade-off between fiscal consolidation and GDP growth for several reasons. One is agents anticipate that the required consolidation will happen anyway, so they increase the savings. The fiscal multiplier was probably not larger at the beginning of the adjustment than at the end, and that's because the forecast of interest rate normalization and a quick return to growth never materialized. So I'm now handing over to Corrado Macchiavelli to talk about the empirics.
Thank you very much, Cyril, for illustrating the results of our counterfactual analysis. So what I'm going to explain next is the empirical exercise that we have performed as part of this evaluation. So as my colleague Cinzia was saying before, this report focused on specific aspects of the Greek adjustment program. So these are meant to zoom in on details of it, but of course did not necessarily capture the complexity of the adjustment programs across the 2010 and 2018 period. Essentially, besides the macroeconomic adjustment, we also looked at the labor market adjustment and the extent to which labor markets played a role. In fact, as part of its adjustment program, Greece legislated a number of reforms to bring nominal wages and prices down, and that was with the intended purpose of restoring competitiveness, so the so-called idea of an internal devaluation. Clearly, Greece cannot, as part of the currency union, use its exchange rate, so restoring competitiveness through lower unit labor costs was one option. So as we move to the next slide, we can see a snapshot of a successful deregulation across the 10-year period. So if we compare Greece in 2008, which is the red bars, with Greece in 2018, which is the striped red and white bars, we can see that there's been a considerable deregulation effort happening across time, and that brought Greece to a much closer level to what observed in the EU in 2018 again. So 2018 EU is the gray bar. So you can see that there was certainly an effort geared towards deregulating a much constrained economy, and that was indeed for sake of facilitating the adjustment of Greece to what was the initial shock, which was the indeed sovereign debt crisis that my colleagues before have illustrated. So as we move to the next slide, the labor market reforms in Greece moved across several dimensions. In particular, we have on the top left chart collective bargaining, which are the red bars, and you can see that certainly after 2012, the effort in sort of reforming labor markets has intensified. That is also clear if we move on the chart to the top right in the panel, where we see that collective dismissal also, so regulation and collective dismissal also was changed substantially during the program. So there is an idea that all these efforts jointly have delivered the sort of expected reduction in wages in Greece, but the initial conditions certainly limited the benefits from some of these structural reforms, and the effect materializes with some varying and sometimes long lags. So if we move to the next slide, we have here the Greek adjustment program in perspective. So as part of the exercise, we also wanted to see how Greece fared compared to other program countries, meaning other countries in the Eurozone that were subject to an external adjustment. And we can see that if we compare Greece to the average of program countries, so Greece is the red line, so we have the continuous red line and the say dotted red line, which is Greece. So we can see that particularly much of the adjustment, if we compare after the trough, so these is wages normalized to the trough, which is equal to 100. You can see that in Greece, really these reforms helped bring wages down, and that is the result is much more pronounced than for the average program countries, where the wage adjustment and structural rigidities instead created a situation in which wages remain much more muted. So as we move along with the following slide, we have the general effect of the program. So we find that generally speaking, the liberalization of labor markets was achieved. In particular, we find that employment protection legislation had an effect in prompting a wage and employment adjustment. We do not find that EPL, employment protection legislation, had a substantial impact on output and productivity, but certainly did have an effect on wages. Now, for product market reforms, we find that product market reforms were only partial, and that can be framed into a larger discussion, according to which we believe that there was insufficient attention for the underlying structural features of the Greek economy, and in a sense, the program settled for a low growth equilibrium, meaning that more attention should have been given to product market reform, particularly trying to create, of course, a business-friendly environment with sake of spurring growth in the medium term. So for product market reform, we do not find that there is a conclusive evidence that those reforms were successful in delivering what they were meant to deliver. And moving to the next slide, we also find in the next slide. So if we can move next, yes, the wage growth following a financial adjustment. So here in this chart, we compare the response of Greece, which is the top panel. In particular, we take Greece after the episode, a recorded episode of what was defined as sovereign debt default in 2012, and that based on a database of Leuven and Valencia. So if we look at the response of wages in Greece, we can see that there was certainly a very long adjusting lag, and it took several years for wages to come back to the level prior to the intended adjustment. And that is somewhat different from what observed, once again, for the standard consolidation programs in the context of the IMF, European Commission, and ECB programs. Now, coming to the next slide. So we also did perform other sort of empirical exercises and check, but generally speaking, we do find that employment and wages change by a similar degree. So in that sense, the adjustment program were successfully in delivering the adjustment on labor markets. Now, could have this been done differently? We argue yes, in the sense that the picture that we paint overall is quite mixed, and that calls for a deep reflection on the Greek experience. So the goals were broadly achieved, as I was saying, but generally speaking, the program, which was aimed at providing emergency funding in order to avoid a Greek exit from the euro, put insufficient attention to the underlying structural features of the Greek economy. One of those being, for instance, that the expected effect of, say, regaining competitiveness through lower wages certainly did not prompt the increasing external competitiveness that was expected. So exports did not, the increase in export was not sustained as it was initially intended. And the financing side also, we claim in the study, was not sufficient, and lack of confidence in the economy, as my colleague has previously shown, had a knock-on effect, in particular on the medium-term growth prospect of the economy. So to conclude, we feel that the sequences of reform was, in a sense, not agreed in the beginning, and political considerations led to prioritize reforms which had the least political resistance or friction. So little attention is being put on, indeed, growth enhancing reform. And so these settled for a low growth equilibrium. So I would conclude here, and happy to take the discussion further during the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Macchiarelli. I would like to thank the three of you, Ms. Alcidi, Mr. Macchiarelli, and Mr. Lenoel. Thank you for the work you did, for your presentations, and I'm sure that you yourselves would like to hear reactions, comments from the four personalities that lived through this political, social, and economic adventure, and were in a way were the protagonists of this adventure. So thank you very much for the moment, and let me turn to the Greek panel of today's discussion. Να περάσω τώρα.
I'd very much like to do some comments. If someone in the audience, by following this discussion, have a post-mortem feeling, they are wrong, because this discussion is very is very timely because it fulfills our need to agree to a minimum of what really happened and to proceed with our discussion. Actually, many of these problems will return in Greece on the post-COVID era. The recession it goes into. So I won't make any comment, and I'll give the floor to the first of our guests, Mr. Yannis Tournaras, the governor of Bank of Greece. Welcome. Good morning. Thank you very much for the honor that I have to be here today, invited by the Economic Chamber of Greece. Everyone has contributed to us being here live today on the Eurozone because, first of all, I'd like to thank the European Commission for the research and, of course, the researchers who did a great job, regardless of the fact if we all agree or disagree to some details. We all agreed to the conclusion, to the main conclusion, that, of course, the programs were successful, but were more costly than what they should be. But we know that now. We didn't know that at that time because things were very difficult, and now, okay, we know more things and we want to get some conclusions for the future so as to avoid some mistakes we did in the past. And I'll say a few things about it at the end. It is recognized in the research that despite the mistakes, there was no alternative. If these programs did not exist, probably today Greece would be out of the Eurozone and completely be bankrupt. So these programs succeeded, of course, on a higher cost than needed, and succeeded in correcting and fixing financial problems and fiscal problems that existed in 2010. So these programs managed to correct several deficits, the budget deficit, and I don't think that any other country of the OECD during this period managed to achieve such an adjustment. There was also a big competitiveness adjustment of about 25%, mainly on the So this happened because there have been many reforms in the economic life, and 15 sets of reforms were implemented and were voted by the Greek government during these years as far as labor market, wages and the health system is concerned, mainly through the establishment of an independent authority for public revenue. We also had a restructuring of the banks and a recapitalization of the banks, and of course there are many things to do, and there are many non-performing loans, and the tax system is also problematic, and we managed to achieve a more extroverted economy. Of course, the debt, the sovereign debt is very big, but now it is repaid very quickly. Interest rates are low, and it is assisted by the IMF, the ESM, the European Central Bank. So let's see the mistakes and the problems. We could achieve all these things in a better way, but of course this is something that we know now. We didn't know that at that time. We now have all these researches that tell us what we could have done better. So first, we had an involvement of many different stakeholders in the negotiations. The negotiations between the IMF and the European institutions. The second thing is that there were many different opinions and conditionalities, and of course a rhetoric of the exit from the Eurozone. As far as the fiscal consolidation, the fiscal adjustment is concerned, I disagree a little with the last research, but on the first program there was a focus on the increase of the taxes and less and of course not in the expansion of the tax base. Next, fiscal multipliers were proved to be much higher than what it was initially expected. When I was Minister of Finance in 2012, it was clear that the measures required by the IMF were much stricter than what it was needed. And when we pointed this out, they said that, yes, but we must have a safety buffer, which was very costly. After that, the IMF talked about huge fiscal multipliers, but the damage had already been done. So these measures expanded recession. Austerity measures were implemented when the recession was already very deep. And we should have taken into account the cyclical deficit and not the simple deficit on these measures on which we were based. Fifth, the reduction in wages resulted in reduction of income, because in Greece, these people are those who contribute to the taxes and the income. Sixth, the loans of the first program brought very high interest rates. And this was a very big mistake, and I agree with Cynthia. We should have proceeded to a debt restructuring from the beginning, at least when the conditions of were met, the conditions of the decision of Eurogroup were met in 2012. So the sequence of the reforms was a mistake, because labor market should go along with the product and services market, and this led to a huge reduction of the wages, and this could be avoided. To some extent, at least. There was a great emphasis on the reduction of wages in order to enhance competitiveness, and not on the structural factors that affect competitiveness. And I don't see nowhere in the research that pointed out there was there was a macroeconomic asymmetry. So this is a very important lesson to learn for the future. Germany and the Netherlands, for example, have surpluses that go over 8% of the GDP. From what we know from the Treaty for Macroeconomic Adjustment, the Macroeconomic Adjustment procedure, this should be these deficits or surpluses must go from -3 to +5% of the GDP. +8% is a very big number. And not only this, when we should impose an internal devaluation in order to improve competitiveness, those countries with the surpluses on the current account deficit managed to increase it more. Of course, there were many ambitious opinions on how we could exploit the public assets, and we should place more. We should have placed more emphasis on the cadastre, which was, of course, made later. There was also a lack of ownership on the changes imposed, and of course some interests in Greece which did not want these adjustment programs to proceed, and I focus on focusing on the reforms. 11th, a very big mistake is that Greece was not led to establish an asset management company, as happens in Ireland, in Spain, or in Slovenia, who handled all the balances of the banks, and this is a mistake that we still pay for. We have non-performing loans. A high percentage of non-performing loans compared to the countries of the European Union. And those countries that created an asset management company managed to overcome this problem. There were many conflicts with countries of the Eurozone who used who wanted that Greece would exit the Eurozone, and OSI should have been implemented in 2014 because all the conditions set by the Eurogroup on November of 2012 had already been met by the summer of 2014.
Number 13, there was a lack of tools to be used in the beginning. What I mean is that at the beginning we were all caught by surprise. We had the no bailout clause. We were stuck with that. The Stability Pact did not deliver. There was a lack of measures which we applied later on, the so-called macroeconomic supervision. Thankfully, the ECB saved the day when the governor said, we will do whatever it takes. Now, conclusions for today. And that's the important thing. Let's take some lessons out of our mistakes. We have to continue, we have to improve the Eurozone's architecture. This is something that is still at stake, and of course the pandemic helped us have a clearer view, and we managed to understand that austerity is not the solution. It leads to recession, and the avalanche caused because of the difference between growth and interest rates is much more important. This phenomenon is much more important when you have a recession as a result of primary surpluses being met. We achieved to have huge primary surpluses, but as Cynthia said, the debt as a ratio, the debt to GDP ratio did not fall. We have to have the so-called banking crisis framework. EBRD is something obsolete. Talking about bail-in in the case of bank deposits as a measure, it's a mistake. This has to go off the table. What we need, as Andrea Enria said, we need a pan-European network of bad banks, of asset management companies, in order to clean the banks' P&Ls out of P&Ls, the ones we have now and the ones to be created as a result of the pandemic. The ECB has to follow suit the policy with the ETB. Sorry, we have an issue with the sound. I think the governor talks about the bonds that have no investment rating. Greece has done whatever they could, but we should not penalize a country. It is very encouraging that the recovery fund, the next-gen recovery fund, is moving forward. That's very encouraging. That's very good. We should not delay a bit. And this fund should become something permanent, a permanent tool at the core, at the heart of the EU. Of course, we need adjustment programs. It's not just about the demand. We also have to discuss about the supply. We apologize, but we have cuts in the sound. We will have to exit. Apologies, but the sound is really bad. The governor says that we need a new monetary policy in order to support the EU's monetary union, because currently that's all we have. It's a monetary union only. We haven't done enough things in order to move forward. Thank you very much. Thank you, dear Governor. We were all very careful during your presentation. I think you proved that this is not a post-mortem discussion. It's a really interesting discussion, and allow me to say that in the years of crossing the desert, the debate was becoming very difficult because it was extremely intense. There was a lot of friction, there was a polarization, and this serenity was something we lacked. It was, after we were over, it was as if we didn't want to go back to that, as if we didn't want to discuss about those 10 years again. And that was equally erroneous, because this would have remained a very painful experience, which we would not have used as a pool to draw conclusions. So thank you very much for both commenting the findings of the study and for giving us your insights. Now, moving on to the next speaker, the current Minister of Finance, Mr. Christos Staikouras. Hello, dear Minister. Hello, good morning. I'd like to thank the Economic Chamber of Greece and the President, Mr. Kollias, for kindly inviting me to attend. I'm really happy to be able to exchange viewpoints with these three prominent scientists, individuals who have played a very important role in the political and social developments of our country, having also filled the chair of the Minister of Finance. Let me start with what you said. Why did this happen? Before we assess, we evaluate the programs, let's discuss why we entered the programs. Maybe there were mistakes there as well. Back in 2008, the European economy has been harshly hit by the global financial crisis that was generated back in 2007 in the US. This crisis had certain grounds that were not momentarily created. There were long-standing ones. The European edifice was not protected. There were no countermeasures and defending mechanisms in place. And of course, there was no proper treatment in place. This crisis destabilized all economies, including the Greek one. The Greek economy has been and still is shallow. There is no productive depth. It was an economy characterized by apparent and long-standing fixations and distortions at all levels, social, political, merit-related, etc. The roots of those weaknesses, of those pathogenies, go back in time and, let's say, entangled with the long-term flaws of the Greek society, and these weaknesses, despite the sporadic attempts to remedy, have not been properly treated in the past. So, as a result, for a long time, the distorted productive model based on consumption was maintained. It was not a model based on trading international commodities and exports. The absence of any kind of understanding and consensus before elections, and the expansive monetary policy after the elections led to high sovereign debt and turned that into a crisis of lending. I'd like to highlight at this point, as extensively acknowledged both domestically and abroad, that a very important role in this development was played by the delayed and reluctant response by the European Union, especially at the beginning of the crisis. As a result, resort to the stability mechanism was unavoidable, and thus led to an enhanced supervision regime. We must not forget that. Now, second question. Is there a common narrative? What are the conclusions following the implementation of such programs? The general conclusion is that the financial program as a panacea to treat such crisis is inexistent. There's no such a thing. Finding the ideal program depends on external and internal political, social, cultural, and financial parameters, both under control and not, by the country in crisis. Successfully undertaking such a program, building a proper strategy, and implementing it determines whether the program will be successful to overcome the crisis or not. First conclusion. The program ownership means a lot for the program to be successful because it determines the anticipations of the consumers, the markets, and the investors. We, as a country, found resort to the stability mechanism, but we were reluctant to implement reforms, the recipe, in other words. So, combined with the delayed response by the EU, this program was deployed in an environment of negative low interest rates. No program should be inelastic and non-flexible. All programs have certain rates of flexibility that relate to the reliability and the efficiency of its government. Fiscal discipline is necessary, but it's not enough to exit the crisis. It has to be coupled with structural and growth-centric reforms and their implementation. Fourth, proper fiscal multipliers and the right policy mix are both important in order to achieve fiscal balance. Literature suggests that the multiplier tends to be higher in times of crisis, which makes fiscal consolidation more costly. In the case of Greece, as mentioned in this study, this adjustment was attempted in times of recession for the European economy. The outcome of this recession to the total demand overcome fully and prevailed over any countermeasure. The multiplier of the financial policy turned out to be really high, and that led to a significant drop in demand. Fifth, fiscal adjustment, based mainly on expenditure, brings positive and long-term results. On the contrary, certain studies, those adjustments that are based mainly on increasing revenues, such as the policy implemented by the previous government, are deemed non-successful. A recent survey by Mr. Ziogas and Mr. Panagiotidis concluded that successful adjustment based on cutting on expenditure drives growth, increase of the GDP and a drop in unemployment, both in short term and after 3 years' time. Fifth, the public investment program, because of its high multiplier, is of critical importance for the development trajectory of a country. Happily, in this regard, from 2013 onwards, the gross capital investments by the general government vary over 3.5% of GDP, with the exception of 2018 and 2019, which is more compared to the rate of the EU member states. Sixth, having a statutory framework in order to secure stability of financial institutions, especially in bank-centric systems like the ones in Greece, is critical. And of course, the last thing is social cohesion. This is jeopardized by poverty and poor distribution of available income, and this plays a very important role for a program to be successful. So, did we manage to draw conclusions and use them? Now, judging by the result, we can support that the second program, the one in 2012, corrected many of the mistakes and the failures of the first one. As characteristically highlighted by this study, the very high rate of Greek bonds in 2012 has proven that despite the 2 years' time of adjustment, investors have lost confidence in Greece. Of course, let's be fair. mistakes were not just an outcome of Greek interventions, but also by the decisions of the lenders. They acknowledge that as well. Also, despite corrections in the second program, this doesn't mean that it was flawless. As stressed in the study, there is a general consensus, including the representatives of the institutions, that the time, the quality, the duration, and the balance of such adjustment and the objectives themselves of the program were not the right ones. However, during the second program, the adjustment period was prolonged. As the government said, the fiscal policy mix was changed. We saw that in the graphs. The Greek sovereign debt profile and its magnitude was improved. The debts to the private sector was paid to a great extent. Certain structural reforms were implemented, and Greek economy's competitiveness was further enhanced following certain tax coefficient cuts. According to a study by the OECD back then, Greece was the champion in materializing structural reforms from 2012 to 2014. The outcome was that in 2014, the country was at a better state, and for the first time ever, after 6 consecutive years of recession, the country had a positive growth rate. This study we discuss right now highlights that in the end of 2014, budget balance was really close to the targets, and fiscal adjustment was successfully implemented and according to plan. It was on track. It is true, of course, that the state of the economy has not been fully normalized. More steps were needed, but of course we're talking about steps to the right direction. Sadly, in the first semester of 2015, as a result of allegedly heroic attempt to improve things, things turned worse. Greece entered into an aggressive downward spiral. The outcome was that, and this is my belief, to a third needless program and to a third needless bank recapitalization. They were needless, they were not useful because, as it is stated in the first page of the study, the objectives of the adjustment program, which is debt relief, rebuilding confidence, and attaining surpluses, have already been attained after the end of the first 2 programs. The years that follow, although Europe was accelerating its pace, our country remained in recession and thus led to shrinking available income for the households, reduced the poverty threshold, and the preservation of financial inequalities. This happened because of the increase in taxes, the attainment of ultra surpluses, something that stopped in 2019. All this leads us to the conclusion that the main objective of a country's fiscal policy is to shield its economy against turbulences and build and create the circumstances in order to achieve sustainable growth, because periods of recession or of poor policy mixes lead to uncertainty, lead to erroneous distribution and allocation of resources, and undermine the efforts to eradicate poverty, to strengthen social cohesion, and undermine the inclusion of the weak in growth. In order to achieve this main goal, a country has to turn to a new, sophisticated, sustainable, productive model according to current standards. A paradigm, a new model that will aim at sustainable increase of competitiveness, productivity, and extroversion, as well aiming at interlinking, interconnecting production with innovation and technology in order to achieve smart, sustainable, and socially fair growth. To this direction, since July 2019, we decided to implement a different policy mix based on wise fiscal policy, including cut of tax coefficients and expenditure, promoting reforms, and promoting privatizations and boosting investments. This trajectory, which was a positive one, in the first semester of 2020 has been halted by the global pandemic. Despite that, During the pandemic, we had to redefine the priorities of our financial policy, but we remained fixed to the day after, which is to implement our reformist agenda. The efficiency and effectiveness of our policy has been proven by both financial and economic indicators, and it's been acknowledged both domestically and abroad by our society, by our partners, the institutions, investors, the markets, the rate of deposits, and the rating agencies. But it's a fact, it's true that things are really difficult, and there's a high degree of uncertainty. In this conjuncture, the Ministry of Finance tries to support the Greek economy in order to face difficulties at the lower of costs, which is to support the economy in order not to lose the momentum, to remain operational and support shielding our country against difficulties, and of course keep a reserve. Having said that, and given all the above, and given that we have enough firepower, that is this 72 billion euros from the Recovery Fund and the multi-annual budget framework, fiscal framework, by the EU, we elaborate a comprehensive plan in order to fully use and leverage these funds. Priorities of this plan under consideration is to support entrepreneurship, to attract private investments and promote innovation, to support employment, cut inequalities, and to support social, local and regional cohesion, to promote digital transformation, technological upgrade of the public and private sector, and of course to upgrade our infrastructure. By implementing cohesive policies on this axis, having a vision with unity, with responsibility, with transparency and social cohesion and justice, we altogether, the state, the employers, the employees, we will be able to reorientate and reprofile the Greek economy so it enters a trajectory of sustainable growth, cut the investment lag, and include our country into the developed countries, into the developed economies of Europe. We will do that, having a plan, confidence, belief in our strengths, a good climate between political partners and parties, and hard work. Thank you very much.
Both speakers until now were just on time, and their opinions were to the point. So our next speaker is former Minister of Finance, Mr. Euclid Tsakalotos. So I'd like to welcome you again, Mr. Tsakalotos. Of course, you want to answer to some political comments made by Mr. Staikouras, but I'd really like you to give us a more integrated, comprehensive opinion, your conclusions on the previous experience. So you have 15 minutes. You can make use of them as you wish. Sorry, there is no sound.
Συγγνώμη, νόμιζα θα το κάνετε εσείς. Ευχαριστώ.
Ξέρετε, το λεξικό της Οξφόρδης περιέλαβε στις λέξεις της χρονιάς το mute, unmute.
So the Oxford Dictionary included the mute-unmute terms on the words of the year because teleconferences are a trend these days. So after unmuting in Greek, I'd like to thank you, the Hellenic Chamber, the Economic Chamber, the CPS and the National Institute. I'd like to talk about the National Institute because whoever was a student in England in the 80s, this institute was a source of knowledge for all the students. It saved us when we had to prepare a research because the overviews of the economy were very accurate, and there were also very accurate articles, well-written articles and understandable. From the students, from distinguished professionals of applied economics. So it's a tradition that during the 80s, when I was a student, this was restricted in favor of the theory and with less emphasis on having knowledge on the economy. And in my opinion, this is obvious on the development of the economies where we had more advisors in terms of theory than professionals knowing actually the economy. So I'd like to point out just 2 or 3 points and focus on them. The first point I'd like to comment is the debt and the confidence, the risk premium, all this mentioned already by the 3 analysts with their interesting presentations. I've also read the text of the research. I will not comment the PSI because Mr. Venizelos follows. Of course, there are differences between me and Mr. Venizelos on the importance of the reduction of the deficit. The research restricts its importance, but this is not the reason why I will not comment on it. Not because I think it is not important, which is not, of course, a very serious point. The critical point is that there was not a restructuring of the debt from the beginning. This is what happens in many businesses, for example, in many banks. First is the debt restructuring, then comes the business plan, which is the plan for the repayment of the debt. So I believe that this was the biggest mistake, the most crucial mistake that had an impact on the 3 memoranda that followed, because there was always Mr. Schäuble or someone else from the European institutions that saying that the debt was sustainable, or that we'll see at the end of the program if we must do more about the debt. The investors that would like to invest in Greece, they said, okay, when the program ends, when you know if the debt is sustainable, then we will invest. So the reduction, the drop in investment, the loss of confidence was impacted by this. And we know that already from the discussions of the IMF on the first program, where there were leaks on the Wall Street Journal. We know that many members of the IMF from the member states of the EU said that this program was a program for saving the banks of the north countries of the Eurozone, especially Germany, the Netherlands and France, and less for Greece. This means that everything would be different if we first had the debt restructuring, and then we could proceed to the memoranda. There would be more confidence, there would be more private investment, and the cost would be higher. Is this because of the member states? Is it a fault of the first government which did not take into account of this issue, which could at that time have a more powerful effect? Whose fault is it? And this, of course, impacted the whole development and process. And despite all things we say, it is very important that we did not accept the negotiations of April 2015, where nothing was said about the debt, and we proceeded to a referendum, which led to the third memorandum, which provided more guarantees that more things about debt would be included, and we let the country We led the country with a solution that was not a final solution for the debt, but we had 10 to 15 years when the flows of Greece for the next 10-15 years are much lower than those of other countries, which gives us the opportunity to have this discussion and the discussion about the future and on how we can make use of this trajectory for the next 10-15 years. The second thing is that especially the analysts of the National Institute told us that it was almost a political choice to proceed to the restructuring. It was more important, more easy to cut on political investment rather than cut on other things of the budget. I do not actually agree with this analysis, and this impacts the investments too. The first point on which I disagree is that the reason for which I disagree is that the supermaterialization of the program was the institutions of the Greek government that existed 30 years before the crisis, which were not made to monitor the implementation of the program of public investment. It was not easy. It's not easy nowadays. It was not easy during the period of the first and second memoranda to be able to see how much this investment program has been implemented. And this meant that we had that many times during my era and during the era of Mr. Stournaras and Mr. Venizelos, we had this high supermaterialization of this program when this was needless. Of course, the solution was not to have more investment at the cost of other expenditure that would cause a bigger social problem. For me, the solution would be to create, to establish memoranda, this I'm telling that for the future too, like something that we discussed in the United Kingdom for the gold rule. You must exclude the investment from the fiscal structure because investments are kind of self-funded. This would be a logic that could help Greece to have a memorandum that would include fiscal goals, but that would fiscal targets, but that would exclude the investment so as to be able to reduce the drop of the income. This did not happen and actually had the consequences we all know. And what impresses me is that the National Institute did not catch that because it has a tradition on how we should measure and treat investments when it comes to the fiscal sector. The third thing I want to point out is about the reforms in the labor market and the product and service market, is that first, the research does not go much into the macroeconomic consequences of microeconomic reforms, because when you do such reforms in the labor market, regardless of the fact if they are okay or not, in my opinion, they were not very successful, or in the product and service market, these reforms also have macroeconomic consequences, which in turn were on a specific direction on the expansion of the austerity, the deepening of the austerity. And this was something that we should point out. Moreover, in order to be able to evaluate, to assess the memoranda, we should also see the microeconomic level in order to be able to evaluate its consequences. Not all reforms were made to the correct direction. There should be a research were several research on the milk, on the dairy market indeed successful, or did they not work actually, and the final consumer did not have any gain? So such research, such evaluation must be made on a per product or a per service basis. Otherwise, we will not be able to see which reforms were successful or not. And I'd like to say that the analysis, despite what National Institute believes, that the analysis on labor market showed a big gain because wages were cut. But it did not take into account the structural reforms on this sector, because the only thing is not the cuts on the wages, but to see if it helps the restructuring of the economy in order for it to go higher on the value chain, to change the production activity. Otherwise, the wage cuts would lead to a situation similar to that of Bulgaria, for example, and this was an official statement by the IMF. So we must look seriously into the output restructuring of the country, and these were the main points on which I wanted to focus. In general, some general comments. From its nature, the research does not go deeper it does not point the responsibilities of the member states. Mr. Stounaros talked about the asymmetry where the burden is borne by the countries with a deficit and not to those who have a surplus. The restructuring was not made from the beginning, and we must analyze the responsibility of the institutions themselves. For example, the IMF for many years was practicing backward engineering. I can't find a good translation in Greece for that, but it means that the IMF had decided that it should always press for lower wages and pensions, higher taxes, and it should convince that these cuts were necessary. I'd only like to say that until 2018, January of 2018, the IMF expected that the government of Syriza would have a primary surplus of 1%, when in 2016 we had more than 3%. So that shows that an analysis for the institutions is also necessary and for their role. In my opinion, overall, no analyst can say that the three memoranda were a success story. The cost, the social cost was very high, and I think that all three analysts and the two previous speakers and I have said many things on how this cost could be less. We would not say the same things about the cost, but I think that there is a consensus on this framework. And this is not only important for the past, but for the strategies we want to follow for the future. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Your comments were very important, and the analysts that presented their conclusions listened to your comments, and probably they can we can have a discussion on that to reply on your comments.
So, last but not least, in great Greek language, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance at that really critical times, Mr. Evangelos Venizelos, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Tsimas. Can you hear me? Yes, yes. I'd like to thank the Economic Chamber of Greece, Mr. Kolias, the President, and of course the SEPS and the National Institute for their work. Ex post assessment of the so-called policies of the memoranda of the bailout agreements is a laboratory-like process, scientific one, but the atmosphere of the 2015 period before and after that was not rational, was not like a laboratory or cool. The stake of this country was, the future of the country was at stake, of the country, of our democracy, of social cohesion, of national sovereignty, of foreign affairs, and security and defense. The dilemma was a coordinated process or a chaotic move backwards. It wasn't just about staying in Europe, but staying in the West. Especially, the capabilities of the European Union were at stake, whether they were able to tackle critical circumstances. The European Union is built for normal conditions of pressure and temperature, and they used to believe that they could still keep on living in the world of the Stability Pact. But it was found before new problems that highlighted both internal inequalities of the Union and the external pressures, starting with the ones exercised by the markets. Europe was delayed in its response, a bit embarrassed, a bit idle. Then it became more active, but always the response was conventional. This conventional response changed quite recently, a few weeks ago, as a result of the pandemic. I'm quick to say that the contribution of the Greek experience in the timely and unconventional response of the European Union to the pandemic-driven recession is huge, but the cost of this training we provided was paid by Greece mainly. Let me remind you that in 2009-2010, Article 136 of the Treaty on the Operation, on the Function of the European Union has not been amended. ESM has not been established. The gigantic QE program has not been implemented, especially now. It was later on when, in theory, the OMT program has been coined. There was no recovery and restructuring fund. Nobody used to discuss about the issuance of common debt. So I agree with the study when they say that a detrimental effect and an impact on the recession and the deterioration of the debt to GDP ratio in Greece was because of the uncertainty in the Greek economy and the uncertainty as a result of the discussion about a potential Brexit and bankruptcy. This climate could have been easily turned around should the stance by our partners had been encouraging. Let me clarify that the attitude, the stance of our partners had been much better than their rhetoric, but the messages emitted to the international and domestic market are communicated via the rhetoric. This affects not only political rhetoric, but also statements by technocrats and executives, the continuous visits by the Troika, the style of their statements, the problems and the ongoing discussion about the sustainability and the need to have a second or a third program in place. All these led the rating agencies to certain conclusions, and of course in Greece there was no program ownership. This was delayed a lot. The program has not been politically and socially accepted and adopted, and as a result, the memoranda was the reason of friction between political parties and within political parties. So there was a huge political problem. Let me remind you my proposition back in spring 2010 to discuss the voting of the first program with enhanced majority in the parliament. The fiscal adjustment programs have had a training purpose with a specific punishing dimension to Greece. In Europe, statistics have been embellished. Although everybody knew, I'm talking about Brussels, everybody knew that Greece has been facilitated in order to enter the Eurozone, in order to facilitate the accession of Italy in the Eurozone because of its size. There was a punishing attitude vis-à-vis Greece because it used to borrow money from the European Union with the same interest rates as Germany, and to a certain extent this led to the triple crisis: debt, deficit, and competitiveness. Let me remind you the Deauville statement by Mr. Sarkozy and Mrs. Merkel back in autumn 2010, when the first program has already been led to a dead end, and they invited markets to assess the fundamentals of its country individually, and then to discuss about the lending terms and conditions, in other words, the interest rate. So, in other words, I agree with this conclusion and with the conclusion by the study of the National Institute that in no way should the public investment budget be decreased as early as in the onset of the crisis, 2009-2011. This happened not because the Greek government had a problem with managing those money. We had huge problems, but the NSRF program was in place and it was under the EU supervision, so the public investments could go on track with no problem. Contrary to that, certain measures should have been taken in order to preserve the level of investments, but these had to be included in the memoranda themselves in a binding way. The Troika knew already that cutting down the budget and the public investments budget was the easy way in order to achieve the shrinking of budget deficit and then the attainment of primary surpluses. I agree with the National Institute's study that the intervention by the European Central Bank should have been quicker and immediate and more intense, including the Draghi's statement, we will do whatever it takes, in order to protect the Eurozone, the member states, and to avoid Brexit. We waited for Mr. Draghi to take office back in springtime 2011 for this to happen. We had to wait for this belief to become more mature in Germany in order to support Draghi's policy. And I have personally experienced the transition from one state to another. Of course, since 2010, a front of the European Central Bank and Greece should have been established in order to fight, in order to support debt reprofiling. But at the beginning, every critical stakeholder was against the debt reprofiling, including the IMF. Historical truth is that with Wolfgang Schäuble, the framework for debt reprofiling has been agreed back in late June 2011, and a few weeks later, this has been announced by the European Council on July 21st, 2011, before Mr. Draghi took office formally. But then the ECB actively supported this reprofiling, from which its own portfolio has been exempted. I'm quite concerned by the viewpoint that a prolonged period of milder adjustment could help to alleviate the crisis and meet the targets. The total duration of the adjustment program was 8 years, including 3 programs. The first one was set to last no more than 2 years. The total loan of the first program was apparently inadequate, and it provided for no debt reprofiling. It demonized it. It accused it of something really bad. So this was a lack of the first program, and of course Greece has actually no contribution to the first program because of its fiscal status and the emergency to find money. Partners of Greece have a posteriori accepted that the multipliers have been determined in a wrong way. But it was obvious early enough, when the first program was being implemented, that the fiscal multipliers have had a completely different approach. It was obvious that a set of fiscal reforms might, 1 percentage point of fiscal reforms might lead to 2 percentage points of recession and unemployment. This was the basis of the so-called conflict of mind with Troika back in September 2011, when the Troika insisted on taking more measures, more austerity measures in the context of the failing first program, although the European Council and the Eurogroup have already accepted the second program's framework. So, this fiscal adjustment had also another strategic advantage, that it made the political system to implement and the Greek society to accept the necessary reforms that were supposed to support competitiveness, while at the same time having very strict fiscal measures to cut down on pensions and to cut down on wages. So, a society which feels being under aggression and under attack has no will to support such reforms. Politically speaking, a populistic opposition aiming only to capitalize the political disaccord, it doesn't go hand in hand with structural reforms. It doesn't help building a climate of political and social consensus. I'm really happy that these studies highlight that structural reforms in product markets and labor markets were very important. Everybody wanted a balanced mix with a drop of public expenditure, with no drop of investments, with an increase of public revenues, with no tax coefficients increase, and with no tax base being enlarged. So the balance between 2010 and 2019 has been affected mainly by the fact that we exited the third program by means of a policy based on surpluses in the 2017-2019 period. Of course, there were political and social difficulties back then, as I mentioned. During the fiscal adjustment, however, all structural reforms took place, the ones that I mentioned before. Of course, I agree with the SEPS study, according to which in the 2012 PSI debt restructuring, the official sector involvement was significant because it drove a very permanent dynamic. Then the official sector, the OSI happened, and of course we have had their concessions before that. And this is what will be used, the OSI will be used in order to secure long-term debt sustainability. In 2012, the drop of annual debt repayment costs by 60% meant a lot, and of course this helped the Greek debt to become sustainable. This was the original plan for the restructuring. However, in order to have the OSI in full, we have had to have the PSI implemented in full and have the great part of the Greek sovereign debt in the hands of partners, so we should have made it hybrid, and of course being settled as a result of the intervention by ESM. The main problem was not economic. It was deeply political, both within the Eurozone and the Commission, and then within Greece. Political problem, on the one hand, would feed the other, and vice versa, would fuel the other and vice versa. Of course, the differences within the European Commission and the ECB, and of course the differences within at the IMF headquarters played a role. The European Council rightly decided to review the institutional and practical approach by the Troika, but all decisions were political, were taken at an intergovernmental level. The German government played an important role. There were no significant countermeasures to the German approach, but we should not undermine the domestic fixations of certain European countries, which led not to take or to take with a delay certain measures and interventions. And of course, their contents have always to be complemented. Of course, solidarity was huge, was vast, the support was unprecedented. And Greece remained within the Eurozone, remained within the EU with a financial debt which was sustainable and hybrid. Pointing the finger, identifying who's to blame, doesn't reduce, doesn't mitigate the responsibilities of the Greek state before that. The Greek people made their choice, influenced by populistic promises, knowing the cost. They voted for, in a specific way, in the general elections of 2015, during the referendum of the 2015, they opted for maybe a different stance would have led to a different macroeconomic and financial outcome. Now that we are amidst a second crisis, of course, we are exempted by the Stability Pact. Sovereign government grants are allowed. We have a colossal QE, and Greece is included in that. And also, we have the recovery fund. Once these measures are terminated, we will not go back to the old Stability Pact. I hope we will have a smarter and more flexible one, but we will still have huge inequalities. That's why we have to be prepared along both to restructure our economy and protect it, because the day after will be a very difficult one. Thank you very much, dear President. Thank you both for your comments and for sharing your testimonials. We were there, you experienced all that process. There's one point in which I fully agree upon what you said at the beginning, that in a certain way, what we currently discuss, that is the Greek experience, the Greek labors, helped Europe to find a way and react against the current crisis in a different way. Sadly, this is a truth to be told. Everybody has to accept this truth, that it was our own lessons that they learned, but we had to pay for that in a painful way. So, this is the end of the first circle of interventions. Now, let's open the discussion. But first, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Staikouras. I know, dear Minister, that you have to leave. You have to go to the Parliament, so let me give you the floor for your final remarks, and then you will be released. Thank you very much for your understanding. My colleague, Mr. Tsakalotos, knows that the meeting in the Parliament to discuss the next year's budget is about to start, and I have to go there. So, I agree with all previous panelists on 3 points. A, Mr. Venizelos is right when he says that we have to be prepared for the restructuring of our economy in the post-COVID era. Of course, he is also right when he said that the dosing and the treatment period play a very important role when talking about fiscal adjustment. I will also agree with Mr. Tsakalotos that the public investment program, when implemented, was also closely linked to the weaknesses of public administration. He's right, we have suffered that a lot. And I will also agree with Mr. Stournaros. He knows very well, because we have worked together, that one of the objectives set in the past was that the right way to assess the fiscal adjustment has to be carried out in a cyclically amended way. So we have to consider the financial cycle. So these 3 remarks, these 3 comments have to be added, because they are lessons learned from these 3 financial fiscal adjustment programs in order to complement what my colleagues have just said. Thank you very much. Thank you, dear Minister. I wish you the best with this meeting that's about to start.
So now, I'd like to ask the 3 analysts.
Cyril Lenoel and Corrado Macchiarelli. What you said, your work, your research, I think has been overall accepted as correct and by our commentators. But there were some points where your findings were criticized by Mr. Stournaras, by Mr. Tsakalotos, and by Mr. Venizelos. So I don't know if you have any reactions to what you heard, any comments that you would like to make.
Yeah, so I can sort of
yes, Mr. Macchiarelli.
Reaction, and I'm sure. Yes, so I can have a quick reaction, as I was saying, and then I'm sure my colleague Cyril will also like to say something. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned before, and as we have mentioned before, you know, it was a very difficult exercise in the sense that we had to strike a balance in between evaluating the macroeconomic adjustment path and sort of provide a picture that was, in a sense, you know, specific enough, but clearly there are many more complexity. It has been mentioned among those complexity, two of them that clearly we have discussed in passing in the report, but of course, by the scope of the report, we weren't able to take on board. One of them being the sort of rebalancing of growth within the Eurozone. It has been mentioned before, the asymmetry of treatment in terms of the stability and growth pact in the 5% ceiling as opposed to the minus 3% floor. So clearly that argument of rebalancing growth within the currency union is indeed a very important element, and the report only focuses on the aspect of deflating or sort of providing ways to Greeks, but we didn't have the chance to discuss, the idea or the counterfactual of a possible rebalancing of growth within the currency union. But certainly this is a very important dimension that ought to be taken into account and discussed. The second point that represents another complexity, and if you want a limit to the report, is that in identifying structural reforms and the extent to which there's been an effort in deregulating labor and product market, the identification of these regulatory efforts and structural reforms is not a trivial exercise. So in that, certainly one could dig in further across the microeconomic dimension, and the fact that we stick to a macro picture doesn't mean that we didn't have a macroeconomic dimension. But as I said, the very scope of the analysis was that of providing an idea using mainly our macroeconomic toolkit, which is NIGEM. So by assumption, the model required making a number of assumptions which might sound strict in practice, and certainly for people intervening in the panel who have participated firsthand in the Greek adjustment program. So clearly there are limits to performing counterfactual exercise as well as an empirical exercise, because there is an obvious measurement error, and the fact that we had to draw on specific assumptions on that. And finally, the last point I'd like to comment upon is that of multiplier. Absolutely, there is under everyone's eyes the fact that fiscal multipliers were largely underestimated during the Greek crisis. In fact, that represents a very important part of our report and sets the framework for analyzing the counterfactual that we have provided. Clearly, the misconception around the multiplier led to a sequence of policy mistakes, as elucidated by the other speakers, and this is something that it is clearly laid out in the study. But I'll give also the word to my colleague Cyril Lionel, who might want to comment or come back on some of the points that have been raised.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Ms. Alcidi would like to add some comments. Yes, Ms. Alcidi, you.
Yeah, maybe very quickly, I would just like to follow up on a comment which was made by Mr. Tsakalotos on debt restructuring and the fact that it would have been much more effective to have it in 2010. I have to say that I was already around at that time and took part in some discussion on this topic. And at CEPS, we have actually put this on the table, and the proposal was not very much liked. Actually, we were considered quite aggressive in the thinking. And as Mr. Venizelos said, I mean, the IMF was certainly against it. you may recall a quite famous paper which was discussing debt restructuring in advanced economies as unnecessary, undesirable, and unlikely. I also have to say that I do not really recollect a big call from the Greek side on having a restructuring immediately. So in this sense, I think that the consensus was actually against debt restructuring. Now, with some insights and with the experience that we had in 2012 with the PSI, I have to say that my reasoning has actually changed compared to 2012. And when we discuss about sovereigns and the restructuring of debt of sovereigns, we are talking of something which is very complex and which doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need to have in place a framework and you need to have a safety net. And none of them were in place in 2010. So in this sense, I wonder actually how constructive it is to have a discussion on the fact that restructuring was better or would have been more effective if it had happened in 2010. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chidi. Mr. Lenoel, would you like to add a comment?
Yes, thank you very much for the comments. I mean, I would like to talk a bit about like the framework of those adjustment programs. So I agree with like all the different ministers that say essentially it was it was a sort of a crisis mode, and so you had to sort of set up the institutions and the response as you were sort of responding to the crisis. And what we really wanted to show in our study was that this lack of confidence and this very large increase in risk premium can be explained by the fact that there was not a concerted effort to solve all those problems in a clear framework. So it's both like the sort of international side and the Greek national side, where if you had a better coordination, better commitment, an earlier commitment by the ECB to act as a last resort to exclude the Brexit possibility, then the outcome would have been much better. And clearly, that's one of the lessons to be learned, for other European countries and for crises to come. And in particular, as we have, now the pandemic hitting the Greek economy again, then clearly we are better prepared, but there is still some effort to be done in terms of having more robust European institutions. I also agree on the points on the fiscal multipliers. I mean, they were clearly higher than expected, but ex post it's always easy to know, and because of the sort of the length of the programs, then it was difficult to know exactly which policy mix would have been the best. And for example, one difficulty we had when we analyzed, the impact of tax increases rather than expenditure cuts, is that you have 3 different programs over a long time. So the focus has changed a lot in between the programs, and it's not clear how you put a counterfactual of exactly what would have been the best options for Greece, because a lot of things have changed both in the Greek economy and in the European economy. So yeah, that was my two main points.
Thank you, Cyril Noel. Thank you very much. Λοιπόν, κύριε Στουρνάρα, μιλήσατε πρώτος, ακούσατε διάφορα στη συνέχεια.
Mr. Sturnaras, you posed some questions and you presented your comments, so I'd like an overall comment from you before we close. Yes, and this will be my last comment because there is an ECB meeting following this one. I think this was a very productive discussion. We are grateful to the analysts that made this analysis and see things as the third person because we are insiders. So it's very good that 4 colleagues that were not involved have performed this research and were led to these conclusions. So the lessons that I think we have learned is the most important things. The mistakes that were made should not be made again. And it's very important to keep these lessons. And I believe, I've also said that to the Parliament, that this was the biggest assistance. The 3 memoranda give us the biggest assistance ever given to a state. So this was given on very beneficial terms. The amounts we pay today are much lower than those of other countries with a lower debt than Greece. So we must explain to the people that Eurozone countries, mainly Eurozone countries, decided to help and give 280 to 190 billion euros to Greece with very beneficial terms, and this is a reason why the programs were successful and Greece is still in the Eurozone besides the initial problems. So, as a conclusion, during recession periods, you should not impose further austerity. So this is the important thing is the difference between the economic growth and the interest rate. The difference must be positive. So if we do not want the sovereign debt to raise, and we want to constrain it. The second thing is that we must pay attention at the symmetric adjustment. We must try to take the burden from countries which do not have fiscal space. Keynes also stated that, but we have not yet learned this lesson. We need common action, fiscal action, monetary action. Pandemic brings positive things besides all the bad things, that only by common action we can be successful during crisis, monetary action and fiscal action. The ECB must not return to programs that exclude countries that do not have an investment rate which is low, and this is due to the past and not to the present. We should also move away from the ELA because Greece does not have any reason to get back to an ELA, and this is from the second semester of 2015 when Mr. Tsakalotos was Minister of Finance. The country was directed to a fiscal trajectory which was correct. No mistake has been made. Of course, the pandemic affects this debt, but this is not a reason when the pandemic is over to exit the programs that are beneficial for Greece, the ECB programs and the EU programs. The EU Generation Fund must become a tool that is permanent for all countries, and the member states must take their responsibility and do whatever it takes. This is what Mario Draghi said, to do whatever it takes to improve their political system and take the appropriate measures. So what we must do, we must proceed to reforms, and the pandemic is not a reason to delay these reforms. On the contrary, we should accelerate them so that we can achieve a better economic growth when we get out of the pandemic. We also have other problems: climate change, digitalization. Climate change is a very important problem which has not been mentioned, and we experience it every day when we will still experience it in the future. Education, digitalization, universities, businesses must be united. We should create a triangle of knowledge, and this is very important. And, of course, Cynthia also talked about that. Unfortunately, Mr. Venizelos also mentioned it, the debt restructuring has not been made as of the beginning because it was an asset for the negotiations by our competitors, by our lenders. The OSI should come at the end of the program as a reward, because at the beginning it was considered a hazard. They did not have confidence in us. I think that now they can trust us. Deauville was also a big mistake. This is something, of course, we found out at the end. The ECB was not informed, the European Commission was not informed about Deauville. That's all from me.
You know, I was in Ireland the day after Deauville. You should have seen the Irish. They dropped dead when they learned about the Deauville thing. They were really amazed. I fully agree with what you said. Thank you very much. And of course, I acknowledge your comment that this discussion has been extremely interesting, because we've been discussing about these things when we were at a chaotic situation, when temperature was 140, and now that the temperature is normal, we should discuss them as well. Thank you very much. Mr. Tsakalotos, I know you have to leave, you have to go to the Parliament. My apologies, you have the floor right away. Thank you. I will be really brief for the reason you just mentioned. Paradoxically, although a member of the Syriza party, I will make a comment reference to Donald Rumsfeld. Do you remember what he said? There are things we know, there are things that we know that we don't know, and there are things that we don't know that we know, that we don't know whether they exist. So, in the context of this debate, I think we have the first two, and the third one is lurking somewhere. There are things we know, so Mrs. Alkidi and Mr. Stounaras are not right, because we knew that the debt reprofiling program should have started at the beginning, and we knew that it was on the table, and if it was to happen at the late, this would have been detrimental. There are other things that Mr. Stounaras said about asymmetric adjustment, that this system does not deliver, especially in a Eurozone when the adjustment takes place only from the one side, or like the same happened with the golden route. All systems for currency exchange stability didn't work if it's only from one side. And there are other things that we don't know. For instance, what are the reforms that delivered? What are the ones that failed to deliver? We need empirical analysis to conclude about that. And it's important to know, because it's not apparent, it's not obvious what will be the reform with a long-term impact and what will be the ones that will have no such impact. And there are things that we don't know, the so-called known unknowns by Donald Rumsfeld, like the kind of political discussions, what led us to this point, what were the main players. These are things we don't know at all, and I think they will be disclosed in the future by the historians. A couple of comments. First one. Greece suffers when it comes to wisely managing knowledge. A serious, sophisticated society, knowledge should be disseminated. It should be in the hands of the employees, the workers, the unions, the syndicates, the unions, the governments. Greece has never had a plan or programmed to anticipate for crisis and, of course, tackle such crisis by using this knowledge. Last remark, in order to say something different compared to Mr. Tsimas. Dear Mr. Tsimas, we have had a 24% drop of the GDP, the largest drop of GDP in the history of capitalism in times of peace. So it was quite reasonable that the temperature rose. It was quite reasonable that there was friction and heated discussions. The crisis was huge. I know everybody is trying to be reasonable and logic, but let us not forget what the Greek people went through during this crisis. My apologies, especially to Mr. Venizelos and the other speakers, but I have to go to the Parliament, so my apologies for being forced to leave this beautiful panel. Thank you. Mr. Venizelos, you have the closing remarks. Let me say something about the present and the future. And the final remark that I could entitle From One Crisis to Another, because the cycle of the financial economic crisis of 2008-2018, sort of, but now we have another cycle, the pandemic-driven economic crisis. We see the kind of difference in the approach, because now there is no moral hazard to be attributed to any member state. There is a symmetric crisis, an exogenous and external crisis. We have a colossal externality with respect to the global and European economy, but we see the difference in the approach by the European Union. I mentioned about that. Now we have the general clause of exemption from the Stability Pact. Now we have agreed, more or less, that we will issue a Eurobond, something which was inconceivable. It was something not even discussed back in the past, because the next-gen fund will be partly based on issuing common debt. Of course, if we overcome the problems set by Hungary, by Poland, they have their own issues with the the rule of law, and it's right that the EU insists on the rule of law being fully implemented. We have the colossal QE program, which is a response to the attack against the ECB and the European Court by the General Federal Constitutional Court following their famous Vice decision on the control of exceeding community responsibility, the so-called ultra-virus control, on the PSPP, which is the previous pre-COVID QE program by the European Central Bank, in which Greece was not a member. The reply is that PPP, this is the response, a PPP which includes everyone, there are no limits, there is no end to that. We see how easy it is for everybody to be included and to agree this kind of approach by the ECB. I think that the main assumptions will change, the ones that govern global economy. And the Eurozone has to have its own positioning, the ones that's necessary in the post-COVID era, but Greece will find itself against new inequalities. A, fiscal inequalities, because Germany now gives 25% of their GDP to support German companies, whereas Greece provides government grants to the extent possible, much lower, of course. So we will go no more than 30 billion euros, and the German grants exceed 1 trillion euros, if I'm not mistaken. So half government grants provided within the EU are German. When we exit the crisis, there will be a different level of competitiveness, of corporate competitiveness, and we will see whether there will be a new Deauville then, because now we all have negative interests. Maybe in the future someone might say, be careful, you have to check the fundamentals of each member state, and then react accordingly. as markets. So we have to be well prepared for that, and we have to move to the direction of saving economies, given the measures taken, grants, subsidies, the entire package, yes, but also we have to move towards restructuring, reforming, because unless we carry out reforms now, when this phase is over, I estimate that it will last no less than 18 months more, maybe 24 months. We will then find ourselves before these new problems for which we have to be prepared. Thank you very much. Very interesting projection to the future, helping us to foresee what will happen in the future. While you were talking, I'm really paying attention to you and paying attention to the beautiful painting you have before you. It's a painting by Mrs. Marilisa Vlachaki, inspired by famous Greek author Vizinos, because there was an exhibition organized, paintings inspired by Greek literature. So let's pay credit to the creator. So I was looking to the painting while you were talking. I was really enchanted by that. Thank you very much. So thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank especially CCLCD.
I would like to thank also the Greek panelists. It was an extremely interesting discussion, and I don't want to pet ourselves, but I think it was maybe the first down-to-earth debate, logic-driven debate about what tormented us for 10 years. Now we have this study at hand, and we can discuss about these things maybe in a bit more productive and cold-blooded way. Thank you all very much. Now the word to the President of the Economic Chamber for his last remarks. Dear President, I think we can host another event to discuss about the debate we just heard. Indeed, it was really interesting. I'm really proud of the level of this debate, and I'm really proud of the fact that this study, signed by these two acclaimed institutes on a very critical period of the Greek economy, is something that allowed us to bring these four major personalities around the same table. It's the first time. Actually, for me, Mr. Tsima says, this is the panel of my dreams. Yes, I'm really happy, and I'm really happy that we encouraged you to come and we tempted you to say yes to our invitation because of the panel and the study. So I'm really happy that we had this event. Let me thank the Athens Exchange Group and their president for helping us by being our sponsors to host this event. I'd like to thank everyone in order to have this event taking place. I'd like to thank the staff of the chamber, and I'd like to renew our meeting for the next forum, the third one, on another debate, on with another agenda related to the Greek economy. As it was said before, we exited a crisis, we are entering a new one. So the chamber, by means of specific and concrete proposals, we try to give solutions to the issues of the Greek economy. Thank you very, very much.